Apprentice Explorer, Chapter 3. The challenge, as John Rae understood only too well, was to solve the geographical mystery of the Northwest Passage. The blanks in the map were so extensive that the late Thomas Simpson had imagined he could fill them in by descending the back river to the Arctic coast, from where he would travel eastward, possibly all the way to Hudson's Bay. Rae wisely resolved to reverse this approach. Using 2 small boats, he would sail north of the coast of Hudson's Bay and then sledge westward across Boothia Felix, so named by analogy with Arabia Felix of ancient Roman cartography, and also to honor Felix Booth, a British patron of Arctic exploration. If Boothia Felix proved to be an island, as most experts expected, Rae would not only complete the survey of North America's Arctic coastline, but would also discover the Northwest Passage, establishing a link between navigable waterways extending from the Atlantic and from the Pacific. Later, although his own fingerprints are all over this plan, Rae credited Sir George Simpson with having devised it. Certainly the only way he would be allowed to implement it. Sir George, a ruthless, tyrannical potentate known as the Little Emperor, had long been acting with one eye on prosperity. Born a bastard in 1792 and raised by his aunt and his grandfather, a Presbyterian minister, in Inverness in northern Scotland, Simpson had already contrived to eradicate so much of the historical record that even his biographers know little about his youth and early manhood. In his written orders, Sir George took pains to make Rae's expeditionary plan sound like his own, warning, for example, that the explorer would have to winter among the Inuit while living off the land. Rae, though not the originator of this practice, would become its foremost exemplar and practical exponent. He accepted the formal invitation with alacrity and ever after went along with the governor's fiction. My life, for some years past, had been such as was best fitted to prepare me constitutionally to endure such hardships and privations as one is likely to be exposed to during an Arctic summer or winter, whilst my sportsman's experience might possibly be useful in another way in the event of scarcity of food. Such, I know, was Sir George Simpson's idea. Before he could even begin to act, Rae would face so many challenges that, in retrospect, it looks as if fate wished to test both his abilities and his resolve. The first problem, a relatively small one, was that he knew nothing about surveying. Simpson ordered him to travel to the HBC fort at Red River Settlement and to spend the winter of 1844 to 45 acquiring this skill and studying such useful sciences as astronomy, geology, and botany. On August 20th, 1844, full of anticipation, Rae left Moose Factory in a canoe with 3 Indians and John Corrigal, a muscular, capable Orkney man who would travel with him widely during the next 3 years. The men ascended the Moose and Missinaibi rivers. They portaged as necessary, then canoed the Michipicoten River south to Lake Superior and followed the usual fur trade route west to Red River. When he arrived on October 9th, Rae learned to his dismay that his intended instructor had fallen ill. While waiting for the man to recover, the young doctor explored Red River Settlement, which had grown up around an HBC trading post established in 1822 at the meeting of the Red and Assiniboine Rivers, now downtown Winnipeg. 4 years later, the worst flooding in living memory almost destroyed the original fort, prompting the construction, 20 miles north, of Lower Fort Garry. This an idea of George Simpson's. He had married his 17-year-old cousin, Frances, and wished to keep her far away from the country wives and children he had disgracefully abandoned. In 1836, the company had returned to the original site and built Upper Fort Garry. The Fort Louis Riel was to seize in 1870 during the Red River Rebellion. In 1844, Rae found in Red River a farming community that would not have been out of place in Orkney. Although farms had been developed in the style of New France, running back from the rivers in long narrow strips, within 5 years, Red River would have a population of almost 5,400, including 2,500 French and Métis, 1,725 fur trade officers and servants, mostly Scottish half-breeds, and 460 Cree. Rae enjoyed the diversity of the people and admired the Red River cart they have developed. This cart, which would one day have occasion to use, could carry 1,000 pounds through mud and marsh and float that same load across a river. It was basically a light box fitted with an axle connecting two enormous spocked wheels. To facilitate repairs, the cart was constructed solely of wood. The wheels were never greased because dust would mix with the lubricant and wear down the axles. As a result, the cart was notorious for its infernal squeaking. While Rae got to know Red River, his designated mentor grew increasingly ill. The man died in November, and Rae resolved that, rather than travel north unprepared, he would delay his expedition and find another surveying instructor. If that meant traveling east, then so be it. The rivers and lakes had frozen over, making canoeing impossible. Rae waited until the heavy snows fell, keeping in shape by snowshoeing back and forth between the upper and lower forts. Then, in January of 1845, accompanied by John Corrigal and 2 other men, wearing snowshoes and driving a dog team, Rae set out for Sault Ste. Marie, 1,200 miles away. As the fittest of the party, Rae and Corrigal had to raise the road, which involved walking ahead and tramping down the snow, without which the dogs would have been unable to travel. Years later, while giving evidence about a proposed railway along the north shore of Lake Superior, Rae would describe the almost impenetrable country that he traversed in the dead of winter, a continuous series of ridges having deep ravines between them where the streams running out to Lake Superior pass through. Rae traveled by compass, shooting game as he went, and he must have astonished the occasional group of natives he encountered. "I went to the north about 100 miles, he would observe, and found the country there difficult to travel over. We were obliged to leave our dogs and carry our clothes and provisions on our backs." North of Superior, passing Lake Nipigon, the apprentice explorer visited James Anderson, a former moose factory clerk, now in charge of an HBC post. Like Rae, he would later be swept into the Franklin controversy. On March 3rd, 1845, after traveling rough for almost 2 months, Rae reached Sault Ste. Marie. Bisected by the border between Upper Canada and the U.S., this busy town had long been a fur-trading crossroads, with canoeists portaging past the St. Mary's River rapids, which linked Lake Huron and Lake Superior. On weighing himself, Rae couldn't help exclaiming over his superb physical condition, noting that he had actually gained 2 pounds to 172, while Corrigal, who had disdained to snowshoe between the 2 forts, had lost 22. Nevertheless, we had both become as tough as nails. From the Sault, roughly 2/3 of the way to Toronto, Rae wrote Sir George asking where he would now go to learn surveying. Communications were rudimentary. No telegraph, no railway, just overland express. And the response, he knew, would take a while. In the meantime, he would be explorer spent time socializing on both the Canadian and the U.S. sides of the water. The former consisted of only 2 or 3 respectable-looking houses, and a motley collection of huts, while the latter was the site of a good-sized village, a well-kept fort, and a garrison of 50 or more men, among them several officers. Sir George eventually sent letters complimenting Rae on his initiative in snowshoeing to the Sault, and directing him to continue east to the Magnetic Observatory in Toronto. There, from a leading astronomer and soldier surveyor, Captain J.H. Lefroy, Rae learned how to use a sextant and establish locations precisely. Again, he visited his brothers in Hamilton and Sir George in Lachine, and his time in Toronto passed pleasantly enough, though I would rather have been in Indian country. By the end of July 1845, back in Sault Ste. Marie, Rae received the official resolution of the HBC's Northern Council authorizing his expedition. He was to sail north from Churchill on Hudson's Bay above York Factory and chart the Arctic coastline from Furry and Hecla Strait, which Edward Parry had discovered from the east in 1822, to the mouth of Castor and Pollux River, where, in 1839, Thomas Simpson had arrived from the west and built a cairn. Rae would command 2 small sailboats and 12 men, just as he had proposed. Sir George sent Rae an inflatable India rubber boat designed by a young naval lieutenant named Peter Alexander Halkett. The prototype, tested on the Thames near Westminster Bridge, included an umbrella sail that doubled as a heavy cloak, and so was called a cloak boat. Rae would declare that this useful and light little vessel ought to form part of the equipment of every expedition. Now, Simpson advised him that at Red River, where he would collect certain necessary instruments, he would also find India rubber paste to repair this airboat. The sailboats would be built at York Factory. Rae hoped they were not yet begun. He wanted to see them put together. On August 5th, as a 7-gun salute resounded over Lake Superior, Rae started paddling west in a canoe. On September 7th, 1845, an HBC clerk named Robert Ballantyne, canoeing southeast on the Winnipeg River, accompanied by natives and carrying furs, was astonished to see a lone canoeist, obviously not a voyageur, but a remarkably energetic and powerful gentleman, approaching from the other direction. Ballantyne, who would later gain fame as an author of adventure stories, knew that, at this late season, all the canoes that normally traversed these wilds had long since passed this way. The approaching stranger set him and his men to speculating out loud. Who could this be? The water was too rough for mainstream discussion, but the meeting was sufficiently singular that both parties had for a flat rock. At that convenient landing spot, as he would later relate in his book Hudson's Bay, or Everyday Life in the Wilds of North America, 1850, Ballantyne learned that John Rae was on his way to York Factory, several hundred miles north. There he would fit out an expedition to complete the survey of the Arctic coast and determine beyond doubt whether or not there is a communication by water between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans round the north of America. To Ballantyne, who knew him by reputation, the 32-year-old doctor appeared to be just the man for such an expedition. He was very muscular and active, full of animal spirits, and had a fine intellectual countenance. He was considered, by those who knew him well, to be one of the best snowshoe walkers in the service, was also an excellent rifle shot, and can stand an immense amount of fatigue. Even so, the author would remark, "Poor fellow! Greatly will he require to exert all his abilities and powers of endurance." The chance encounter so excited Ballantyne that in his book he devoted 2 full pages to it. Unlike previous expeditions, he observed, which involved many men and large quantities of provisions, Rae would proceed with few supplies and a mere handful of men, relying almost entirely on his own gun for food. The men would sail north, secure their boats at an expedient location, and explore the area on foot. They would then spend the long, dreary winter among the Inuit before resuming operations the following spring. Ballantyne, judging Rae to be of such pushing, energetic character that there is every probability that he will endeavor to prosecute his discoveries during winter, if at all practicable, he predicted success, noting that Rae entered upon the adventure not with a vague and uncertain notions of George Back and Sir John Franklin, but with a pretty correct apprehension of the probable routine of procedure, and the experience of a great many years spent in the service of the Hudson's Bay Company. For his part, Rae would observe laconically that he enjoyed a most agreeable encounter with Ballantyne. We exchanged views, his from the wilderness, mine from the civilized world. Then with a warm shake of the hand and bon voyage, we parted on our several ways. At Red River Settlement, Rae switched from a canoe to a York boat, a flat-bottomed HBC workhorse vessel. The largest of these, 40 feet long, could carry 120 bales of fur, weighing more than 10,000 pounds. York boats evolved from an Orkney design: pointed bow, sharp-angled stern, large square sail. Rae knew them to be the safest way to cross a treacherous body of water, such as Lake Winnipeg, which lay directly ahead. Famous among voyageurs for its wicked transformations, this lake can suddenly transform an alluring, mirror-like surface into a tantrum of whitecaps, especially late in the season. Once he had sailed the length of Lake Winnipeg to Norway House, just off the north end, Rae had overcome 2 major challenges in a year. First, he had coped with the unexpected death of his proposed surveying tutor and acquired the expertise he needed. Then, as winter closed in, he had single-handedly traversed some of the most rugged country in the world. Just when he hoped the worst was behind him, however, Rae encountered a third obstacle. Experienced guides and steersmen, who were among the most expert of boat and canoe handlers, were predicting that Rae's party would either starve to death or freeze for lack of fuel in the treeless barrens that lay above the Arctic Circle. That line of latitude, roughly 66½ degrees above the equator, which circumscribes the Earth's north frigid zone. Men were afraid to sign on for the expedition. Even John George McTavish, Rae's old mentor at Moose Factory, was skeptical. While visiting Norway House, McTavish could not help warning, despite his enormous respect for the young man's abilities. Nah, doctor. Take as few men as possible, for nane o' ye will be seen back again. But John Rae would not be deterred. Before leaving Moose Factory, he had hired 2 men, John Corrigal, his trusted lieutenant, and Richard Turner, the Mitzi carpenter and boat builder, whose work had helped win the race with Sir George Simpson. At Northway House, after much debate and discussion, he engaged 5 more men who knew him by reputation. Confident that he could hire another 3 at York Factory, Rae beat his way north, canoeing and portaging the usual fur trade route, to arrive in a freezing gale on October 8, 1845. He had intended to proceed still farther north to the outpost of Churchill, and to leave from there at spring breakup. But when the gale subsided, ice began forming on the rivers, and Rae wisely decided to winter where he was. For over 150 years, York Factory had served as the Hudson's Bay Company's principal headquarters in Rupert's Land. In the 1820s, when the HBC gained control of the Northwest Company, Sir George Simpson had moved the head office to Lachine, near Montreal. But York Factory, still the main supply depot for the company's huge northern department, remained the largest and most profitable of all HBC outposts. Strategically located on Hudson's Bay on a narrow peninsula, Between the mouths of the Nelson and Hayes rivers, York Factory had developed around an old octagon of workshops and residences built in 1787 after a devastating fire. By the 1820s, as business increased, the population had grown until York Factory began to resemble a village, or perhaps a company town. During the following decade, the HBC built a massive 2-story warehouse, roughly 100 feet square, with a storage capacity of 10,000 square feet. By 1845, when John Rae arrived by canoe, the white warehouse dominated a 5-acre enclosure that included more than 30 buildings, among them a school, a church, and many houses. The climate at York Factory inspired no peons. The settlement lay so near Hudson's Bay that it endured dramatic changes of weather. A hot sunny day would suddenly turn miserably foggy and cold, while the reverse never happened. And there was no possibility of flight or withdrawal. The surrounding countryside consisted of marsh and swamp, so that hikers could not go beyond half a mile without sinking up to their ankles or even their knees. The trees in the area, while diverse, with pines, willows, birches, and poplars, were so stunted that to get firewood, workers would have to travel 5 miles, slogging back and forth across marshland. Visitors and residents spoke with one voice. R.M. Ballantyne, who had met Rae on the river, called York Factory a monstrous blout on a swampy spot with a partial view of a frozen sea. James Hargrave, who became chief factor in 1844, after serving 13 years at the outpost, described his longtime home as 9 months of winter, varied by 3 of rain and mosquitoes. His wife, the astute, articulate Letitia Hargrave, initially perceived York Factory as a clump of buildings sitting in a desolate waste of green swamp grass and small scrub as far as the eye can see. Later, thinking no doubt of the disreputable Moose Factory, she qualified that judgment, observing that despite its shortcomings, this was by far the most respectable place in the territory. Late in the autumn of 1845, when he arrived at this improbable outpost, John Rae found that Hargrave had already supervised the buildings of 2 York boats for his expedition, both 22 feet long and 7.5 feet broad. Rae named them North Pole and the Magnet, and found them to work well and to sail very nearly alike. In his unpublished memoir, although not in his published narrative, which also treats this period, Rae describes how, challenged by an experienced sloop captain, with a by no means poor opinion of his own efficiency as a boatsman, and egged on by Corrigal, he agreed to test the 2 boats in a race. Rae gave the captain his choice of boats, and beat him soundly. When the sailor complained that the first boat was obviously better made, Rae switched craft and, in a second contest, bested the man again. After this satisfactory trial, he notes, by which 1 or 2 trifling defects were discovered, the boats were dismantled and housed for the winter. In his secret heart, Rae, at age 32, must have known that he could not only outsail, but also out-hike, out-shoot, out-hunt, out-track, out-snowshoe, out-canoe, out-survey, out-smart, and out-survive any man in North America. Certainly, any European. He had convinced Corrigal, and certainly he impressed Letitia Hargrave, who observed in a letter that he had earned his doctor's diploma unusually early, and has not been home since, nor, he says, opened a medical book for 7 years. He is very good-looking, and can walk 100 miles easily in 2 days. Rae used the winter of 1845 to 46 to consolidate plans for his expedition. He built a small observatory in which he took meteorological readings as often as 8 times a day, recording temperature, barometric pressure, the force and direction of the wind, and the general state of the weather. There too, he practiced surveying and taught its rudiments to John Corrigal and Richard Turner. He also tended to Letitia's brother, William, who had cut his foot with an axe. In turn, Letitia taught Rae to make bread, following a recipe that he subsequently used in the Arctic. Rae and Letitia Hargrave, who was the niece of John George McTavish, were the same age, Letitia having been born in Edinburgh in 1813. At 27, she had married James Hargrave, an aloof, self-contained man, 15 years her senior. Hargrave had served with the HBC since 1819. A young doctor based at York Factory, John Sebastian Helmking, described Hargrave as friendly and affable while on board a sailing ship, but no sooner did he set foot ashore than he became dignified, cold, and distant, like an admiral, who may be pleasant and urbane ashore, but the moment his foot touches the deck, he is the admiral. Discipline prevails, and he may or may not be a tyrant. Hargrave was nevertheless kind in his way, but he had to go into harness at once. This same Helclem described Letitia as one of those nice ladies one occasionally meets with, kind and affable. Although not handsome, she had a decidedly nice face, a very pleasing expression, with a very good figure. She and Hargrave lived in a well-kept house just outside the fort. Already the mother of 2 small children, Letitia kept a personal maid, unusual in the wilderness, wore fashionable gowns, and played the piano. Helmkin described Rae as an active, powerful, broad-shouldered man of medium height, dark and bronzed, full of energy and active as a squirrel, and good-humored and natured. The editor of Letitia Hargrave's letters would later observe that the explorer must have been a welcome addition to York society, as he was a man of great talents and charming personality. It was said of him that he was as much at home at court or in a London drawing room as he was in an Indian tent or an Eskimo snow house. He and the Hargraves found many tastes in common. In 1840, while passing through Stromness aboard the Prince Rupert, James Hargrave had visited the Hall of Clestrain and taken tea with Rae's widowed mother, whom he described as one of the aristocracy here. Yet now some tension arose between Rae and the chief factor, probably a byproduct of the young explorer's close friendship with Letitia. To Sir George Simpson, without elaborating, Rae wrote, "Fortunately, I am no personal obligation to Mr. Hargrave, he being one of the last persons of my acquaintance from whom I would like to ask a favor. Yet, notwithstanding his disagreeable manner, he has a warm and kind heart, when his selfishness will permit it." Later, when Rae was safely far away, he and Hargrave would develop a warm, personal relationship. The turning point came in March 1846, when the chief factor traveled on business to Norway House. There, he was shocked to learn through the northern grapevine that Rae's older brother, William, had recently committed suicide in California. William had joined the HBC in 1827 at age 18. 5 years later, Sir George Simpson described the clerk as a high-spirited and well-conducted young man of tolerable, good education, strong, active, and resourceful. Known as a mechanical genius who could fix anything, William served at Rainy Lake, Fort Garry, Fort Edmonton, Fort Vancouver, Fort Kootenay, and Stikine. In 1842, prompted to chief trader, William Rae took charge of HBC operations in California. In San Francisco, according to Simpson, he mismanaged the company's affairs and embroiled himself in revolutionary politics, then quarreled with his wife and shot himself to death. Having known William slightly, James Hargrave wrote John Rae a sensitive, sympathetic letter, in which he spoke of the worth, pure honor, and unstained memory of his brother. This he sent north with a messenger on snowshoes. During the first year at Moose Factory, John Rae had lost his father, who died at 62 in October 1834. Now, on receiving Hargrave's devastating communication, Rae could not help recalling scenes from his Orkney boyhood, remembering countless sunny afternoons when William had stood like a prince at the helm of the Brenda, calling out orders to his younger brothers while the boys raced the boat's pilots from Stromness. Yet, even in the midst of grieving, Letitia Hargrave tells us the mechanically adept Rae found time to fix her broken clock. Towards the end of April, Rae awoke to the honking of wild geese, harbingers of spring, who were returning in growing numbers. A few days later, the ice on the Haines River began to break up. Rae waited anxiously and tested the ice daily, but Hudson's Bay itself didn't clear for a month. Finally, on the afternoon of June 12, 1846, Rae gathered his 10 men around him. He was well pleased with those he had signed. 6 were Scot, 4 from Orkney, 1 from Shetland, and 1 from the northern country of Rossshire. Of the rest, 2 were French-Canadian, 1 was Mitzi, Turner the carpenter, and 1 was Cree, Nibitabo, a renowned hunter. All had considerable experience in the north. Rae told them, "Gentlemen, tomorrow we depart on the adventure of our lives," and he set them to final loading. The men packed the 2 boats to the gunwales. Besides their own minimal luggage, they stowed 6 muskets and a 3-month supply of pemmican, a nutritious mix of dried buffalo meat and melted fat. As well, they loaded 2 small sheet iron stoves, 1 for each boat, a pair of lamps for burning oil as the Inuit did, several kettles or conjurers with small basins and perforated tin stands for burning alcohol, a fishing net, 4 small windows, each with 2 panes of glass, an oiled canvas canoe, and the inflatable Hellcat boat. The following morning, with all the York factory at the dock, Rae said his goodbyes. He had long since appointed John Corrigal steersman of the North Pole and put the Magnet in the charge of George Flett, a veteran sailor who had served with Thomas Simpson and Peter Dease in the late 1830s. Now, having climbed into the North Pole, Rae gave the order to cast off. Chief Factor Hargrave raised and lowered his arm, and the cannons boomed out a 7-gun salute. The assembled throng offered up 3 rousing cheers as, with 10 men and 2 boats, John Rae sailed north out of York Factory. In his unpublished memoir, Rae observed that this was the first party of Europeans to sail for the Arctic Sea, carrying only 3 or 4 months' provisions, while intending to remain 15 months. There would be little or no fuel, and for food, the men would depend largely on hunting. Rae added that he would never have attempted such an expedition with unpracticed men, and he noted that those with him were well equipped to handle the challenges ahead. Even so, the first night out, Rae lay awake in his tent, assailed by the doubts and fears he had kept at bay during the bustle of preparation. I could not conceal from myself that many of my brother officers, men of great experience in the Indian country, were of the opinion that we ran much risk of starving. Little was known of the resources of that part of the country to which we were bound, and all agreed that there would that there was little chance of procuring fuel, unless some oil could be obtained from the natives. Yet the novelty of our route, and of our intended mode of operations, had a strong charm for me, and gave me an excitement which I could not otherwise have felt. For 2 weeks, Rae beat north against the wind along the coast. On June 27, 1846, he reached Fort Churchill near the mouth of the Churchill River, yet another turbulent highway to the interior. Early in the 18th century, the HBC had built a small post at this river mouth to trade with the Dean, who were reluctant to visit York Factory because of the preponderance of their traditional enemies, the Cree. Around 1730, the company decided to construct a massive stone fortress at this spot, overlooking Hudson's Bay as a final redoubt in case of another war with France. After 41 years, the HBC finally completed Prince of Wales Fort, an imposing quadrangular structure 300 feet square with bastions at each of its corners. The walls were 20 feet high and 6 feet thick and included 40 embrasures for guns of different calibers, among them 18 and 24-pounders. In 1782, surprised by a small French army, Samuel Erne surrendered the fortress without firing a shot. With only 39 men and facing more than 100 interlopers, he decided to fight another day. The French razed Fort Prince of Wales almost to the ground. The following year, when the English regained the territory, Hearn returned, took one look at the devastating site, and built Fort Churchill, 5 miles up the Churchill River, at the site used by Jean Monk in 1619-20. By 1846, the HBC had many posts farther inland. Fort Churchill had developed into a scattering of buildings on a couple of acres of land, an outpost where perhaps 400 people regularly traded. There it was that, early in July, Rae received still more official instructions from Sir George Simpson, sent weeks before by Overland Express. After calling for observations on topography, meteorology, botany, geology, zoology, and the ethnography of the Inuit, the governor advised Rae to return after wintering according to his discretion, either reversing his original route or making his way up the Great Fish River. Simpson concluded on a rather grand note, "Let me assure you that we look confidently to you for the solution of what may be deemed the final problem in the geography of the Northern Hemisphere. The eyes of all who take an interest in the subject are fixed on the Hudson's Bay Company. From us, the world expects the final settlement of the question that has occupied the attention of our country for 200 years. The Northwest Passage, as if Rae could have forgotten." At Fort Churchill, Rae rounded out his expedition party by adding 2 Inuit hunters, an experienced interpreter named O'Ligbuk, and one of his sons, William O'Ligbuk Jr., whose native name was Mar Co. The senior O'Ligbuk had served with Sir John Franklin in 1825-27, and with Dease and Simpson in 1836. Young Mar Co was still to be tested. On July 5, 1846, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, John Rae and his men climbed back into their 2 boats. They were all in high spirits. The sun was shining and the breeze was light. As they sailed northwest, the men spotted white whales playing, sometimes coming within a few yards of their boats. The party made good headway, but late the next afternoon, a stiff breeze blew up and turned into a gale-force wind. The next 3 weeks brought changeable weather and, sporadically, dangerous rolling flows of melting ice. Rae sailed onward along the coast of Hudson's Bay, exploring inlets and surveying the rocky shores of any opening to the Arctic Sea. He collected specimens of birds and other fauna and flora, and, to conserve pemmican, shot game and caught fish. On July 24th, approaching the Arctic Circle, Rae rounded Cape Hope and felt the temperature plunge dramatically. running all night into Repulse Bay, so named because of its treeless, forbidding aspect. The explorer could not shake the feeling that something ominous had entered the landscape. The next afternoon, however, entering a cove at the head of the rocky bay, Rae spotted 4 Inuit men on shore and felt a great surge of relief. Their presence meant that animals would be found nearby. He and his men could hunt successfully. They could trade for fuel and cooking oil and perhaps even sled dogs. Rae lost no time in putting ashore. Taking the younger Oligbuk as interpreter, he approached the local men, calling out, "Teima," which means peace. Fearful at first, the Inuit men, 2 middle-aged and 2 younger, soon relaxed and stood chanting. They were good-looking, Rae would write, a low stature, and much more cleanly than those in Hudson Straits. Their dresses were made of deerskin, and the form so often described, the coat having a long tail somewhat resembling that of an English dress coat. Their legs were encased in waterproof boots, made of sealskin, and they all wore mittens, which they seldom took off their hands. In his Arctic narrative, Rae identifies the 2 mature men as Utu Uniak, who has a formidable beard and whiskers, and Kiri-Igtu'u, adding, "We were soon after joined by a fine young fellow with ruddy cheeks and sparkling black eyes, having an expression of exceeding good humor in his laughing countenance. Our new friend wore round his head a narrow leather band of deerskin ornamented with fox's teeth, and appeared to be somewhat of a dandy in his own estimation." Talking with these and other local Inuit people, Rae learned that a great sea lay 40 miles to the north-northwest through barren country dotted with lakes and rivers. He decided that instead of sailing north along the east coast of Melville Peninsula, and so approaching Furry and Hecla Strait as Edward Perry had done, he would make first for the mouth of the Castor and Pollux River. This meant hauling and sailing at least one of the boats across what is now called Rae Isthmus. On July 26th, aided by 4 Inuit men hired for this purpose, Rae's men began driving the 22-foot North Pole up a river through rapids and large boulders. They covered only 3 miles in 14 hours, but reached a first small lake. Rae and his men traveled 4 more days, rowing across lakes and dragging the battered but seaworthy boat over rocky portages. On August 1st, they neared Committee Bay at the bottom of the Gulf of Boothia. Rae had left 2 men at Repulse Bay to guard the Magnet, and now he set back 3 more. The following day, sailing past a spit of land in a saltwater lake, Rae spotted 2 tents. He landed, and, with the interpreter William Oligbuk, called out of the door of one of the tents. Eventually, he writes, "An old woman made her appearance, apparently just out of bed. As she was very coolly drawing on her capricious boots, she surveyed her visitors without showing the slightest symptoms of alarm, although I afterwards learned that I was the first European she had ever seen. An old man soon after popped his head alongside that of his better half, who appeared to be endowed with a flow of language which set all his efforts to say anything at defiance. A few trifling presents put us all in a few minutes on a most friendly footing." Rae identified the man as Iilak, the woman as Reiluak, and adds, "From a chart drawn by the woman, who, as is usual, at least among the Eskimo, was much the more intelligent of the 2. I was led to infer that there were no opening into the large bay, but through the strait of the Furry and Hecla and Prince Regent Inlet." From Reiluak, then, Rae learned that the deep bay supposed the extent of all the way to the Castor and Pollux River. The bay, so ardently desired by Sir George Simpson and numerous other armchair adventurers, simply did not exist. Boothia Felix was a peninsula, not an island. During the next 3 days, as Rae sailed northwest of Committee Bay, the weather worsened. Realizing that he had no chance of reaching any known points before the ice closed in, he reluctantly turned around. Now, he hoped at least to sail north of the west coast of Melville Peninsula to Furry and Hecla Strait before the season ended. Torrential rains made progress difficult, however, and on August 8th, Rae encountered ice. On pushing out to sea, it soon became apparent that we could not proceed on our course, and that there was but little open water in the direction from whence we had come, and even that was fast filling up, as we could neither advance nor remain in safety where we were. There was only one course open to us, and that was to return downwards, the place from which we had started. Rae was reluctant to turn back, because now he would not complete even part of the survey before winter. If he tried to trace the Melville Peninsula coastline on foot, he would have no time to secure provisions for the looming season of darkness. While heading back towards Repulse Bay, Rae landed on the tents of our Eskimo friends, and they came running down to the beach, led on by the old lady whose fluency of speech I had already remarked, and who appeared determined to sustain her character on this occasion by making more noise than all the others put together, and expressing her joy of our return by loud shouts. The old folk had been joined by two fine, active-looking young men named Ark Shook and Ivit Chuck, who told Rae that the caribou had started their annual southward migration. Hunting season had begun. On August 9th at 6:30 a.m., Rae left 3 of his men and young Marco with the North Pole, and, with 3 others, set out to recross Rae Isthmus. Daylight remained almost continuous, and, after a wet, exhausting 20-hour hike, Rae arrived back at Repulse Bay, where he found his other 5 men surviving, as he had hoped, on modest amounts of fish and venison. 3 years had passed since Sir George Simpson had invited him to devise a plan to resolve the mystery of the Northwest Passage. 3 years of non-stop travel, and test after test. That night, as he lay in his tent, Rae would have been justified in thinking that he had passed every test admirably, and that now, at last, he was ready to face the final examination.